You know that feeling, that
Yep.
little nagging worry when you think about the environment?
Yeah, that sort of background hum of unease.
Exactly. It's almost always there, isn't it? Has it ever struck you that maybe this feeling, this deep environmental worry, actually has a name?
It does, yeah. It's a concept people call ecophobia.
Ecophobia. Okay.
And it's a really useful way to frame a whole lot of our responses to nature.
Right. So ecophobia. Let's really dig into this because I'm guessing it's got to be more complex than just, worrying about polar bears now and then.
Oh, definitely.
For this deep dive, we've pulled together some pretty fascinating threads. We've got academic stuff, psychological studies.
Even some surprising links to like theater and what's happening right now politically.
Yeah, exactly. So our goal today for you listening is to really try and unpack this concept
Get to the heart of what ecophobia means, maybe where it comes from.
and hopefully give you a new lens to look at, well, not just the big environmental issues, but maybe your own gut reactions to them too. Moving beyond just worry to maybe a more informed understanding.
Sounds good. So where do we start? How do we even define this thing?
Good question. Where do we start?
Well, the term itself, it first got some real traction back in 1988. George F. Will mentioned it in a piece for the Chicago Sun-Times.
Okay, 1988. What was his take on it?
His definition was pretty direct. He called it the fear that the planet is increasingly inhospitable.
Wow. Straight to the point. Fear of the planet becoming unlivable.
Yeah, that sets a sort of baseline for the idea, a really fundamental anxiety about, can we even live here?
That definitely resonates, that core fear.
Yeah.
But I imagine the idea's evolved a bit since 88.
It really has. A key figure here is Simon C. Estock. He's done a lot of work on this.
Okay, S-Stock. What's his perspective?
Well, he sees it less as just one simple fear and more like a whole spectrum of responses.
A spectrum. Like what?
It can include that outright fear, sure, but also things like contempt for nature or indifference.
Indifference. That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
How is indifference part of fear?
That's a really crucial point Estock makes. He argues that, okay, some fear of nature is totally normal, right? Evolutionary, basic survival stuff.
Sure, don't poke the bear.
Exactly. But he suggests that modern ecophobia, it often serves different masters, let's say. Less
Yeah.
obvious ones.
Like what?
Like the demands of growth economies or certain ideologies. It can get tangled up in those things.
So it's not always a straightforward fear of nature itself.
Right. Sometimes the fear is obvious, pollution anxiety, climate change dread. But often, Estock says, it's more hidden. It's masked by just routine, habit, not really paying attention to our connection with the environment.
The lack of mindfulness almost.
Precisely. Or even indifference. And he stresses this happens on all levels, big societal norms, right down to individual attitudes, globally.
And that hidden kind, the indifference, that could actually stop us from acting.
That's what's fascinating, yeah. If we're not even aware of feeling disconnected or uneasy, how can we get motivated to make changes, right? It could be a huge barrier.
That really shifts things. It's not just people not caring. It could be a deeper, maybe unconscious response.
Okay.
So that's S-Stock spectrum. But David Sobel had a slightly different angle.
Yeah, so well, he focuses more on the fear of the consequences of what we humans do.
So the effects of our actions.
Exactly. Things
Yeah.
like, huge oil spills, massive deforestation. He calls it a helpless sense of dread about the future.
Helpless dread.
Oh.
Yeah, that feeling definitely rings a bell. You see these massive problems.
Yeah, and it's easy to feel totally overwhelmed, like, what can I possibly do?
Right.
And that feeling, it's very real. Especially, it seems, for younger generations. There was a study with kids aged 10 to 12.
Okay.
It found that 82%, a huge majority, expressed fear, sadness, and anger about environmental problems.
82%. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a heavy burden for kids to carry.
It really is. Hearing that stat, it kind of hits home, doesn't it? You think back.
Yeah, I remember feeling worried even as a kid. Makes
Mhm.
you wonder about the long-term effects of growing up with that kind of background anxiety.
Absolutely. So, okay, we've got this range of definitions. Fear of an unlivable planet, Estock's spectrum, including indifference, Sobel's dread about consequences. Where does this all come from? What are the roots?
Good question. Is it just modern life?
Well, Simon Estock connects it to something very recent and very impactful for all of us, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Really? How does he link ecophobia in the pandemic?
He basically argues that pandemics themselves can be seen as environmental events.
Huh. Okay, explain that.
They often emerge, right, from increased contact between humans and non-human animals. And why is that contact increasing? Often because habitats are shrinking, populations are growing, we're putting more pressure on resources.
I see. It forces interactions that wouldn't normally happen.
Exactly. So, in that light, talking about ecophobia feels even more timely, more relevant now. The pandemic really threw our interconnectedness with the environment into sharp relief, didn't it?
It certainly did, in ways maybe we weren't thinking about before. That's a really powerful connection. These huge global events aren't just isolated. They're symptoms of our whole relationship with nature.
Precisely.
So ecophobia isn't just some brand new 21st century thing then. If it's rooted this deeply, maybe we can see traces of it further back in like culture or stories.
Absolutely. You can definitely trace it back. For instance, think about Turkish folk theater.
Okay.
Studies show it often dramatizes a certain fear and anxiety towards nature. You see these traditional plays where humans are shown dominating the natural world.
Like a way to cope with the fear by showing control over it.
That's one interpretation, yeah. Trying to manage that underlying fear by asserting dominance in the stories.
Interesting. So culture reflects and maybe even shapes these feelings.
And it's not just Turkish folk theater. Eco-critics, people who study literature and environment, they point to ecophobia in Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, like Othello and King Lear.
Exactly those plays. Think about the audiences back then. They knew firsthand about, well, the harshness of nature, grain shortages, bad harvests, brutal winters, big storms.
Things we're somewhat insulated from now, maybe.
To a degree, yes. So these plays, they tapped into those very real, deep-seated anxieties. And remember, this was also a time of major exploration.
Driven partly by resource scarcity, perhaps?
That's part of the thinking, yeah. So the plays weren't just stories. They were reflecting the environmental pressures and anxieties of the era.
And maybe even amplifying them a bit.
Could be. And it wasn't just about weather or harvests. Critics also talk about the monsters in Shakespeare.
Monsters.
Yeah, figures that kind of blurred the lines between human, animal, natural, unnatural. They challenged the established order, the norms about nature, and that created unease, a kind of ecophobia related to the unknown or the uncontrollable in nature.
Wow. It's fascinating how this anxiety just pops up in so many different cultural forms across centuries. Okay, so let's bring it to the present day. Our sources also mention societal impact, particularly in politics.
Yes, that's a key area people look at. There's this argument that widespread ecophobia can actually get in the way of environmental progress.
How so? Seems like fear should motivate action.
You'd think so, right? But consider something like the Green New Deal. The argument goes, if people are mainly operating out of fear, maybe fear of economic changes, job losses, disruption to their lives,
Yeah.
then they might resist big policies aimed at climate change, even if they're worried about the environment long term. The immediate fears can overshadow the bigger picture.
So the fear becomes paralyzing or makes people resistant to the necessary solutions, ironically.
That's the argument, yes. That fear, while a logical response, might block the path forward.
And this connects to political language, too.
It does. Critics, for instance, have analyzed statements by political figures. The sources we looked at mentioned former President Donald Trump as an example cited by some critics.
Okay, and the connection.
The argument presented by these critics is that certain rhetoric, maybe downplaying environmental threats or emphasizing economic anxieties, could be seen as reflecting or even tapping into these underlying ecophobic feelings in society.
And the effect of that would be?
According to the argument, it could limit open, productive debate about climate policy. It might make it harder to discuss things like the Green New Deal seriously if those underlying fears are being activated.
Right. Just to be clear, we're reporting on how critics analyze this, not taking a side ourselves.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the argument that ecophobia can have these real-world sociopolitical effects, influencing how we even talk about climate change.
It's such a tangled web, isn't it? Emotions, anxieties, politics. Makes you really wonder how much of our current environmental conversation is unconsciously shaped by this stuff.
It's a big question. And if you listening want to explore this more, there are a few related ideas that might be useful.
Oh yeah, like what?
Well, there's learned helplessness, that feeling of being powerless when faced with huge problems.
Okay, I can see the link there.
Then there's the term climate crisis, which really emphasizes the urgency. Ecocide, that refers to like massive destruction of ecosystems.
Right.
And eco-criticism, which we touched on, that whole field of studying literature and the environment. Lots to dig into there.
Those definitely sound like relevant connections. And just to recap the key thinkers we've mentioned.
Right. The main names associated with ecophobia would be Simon C. Estock, who gave us that broad spectrum definition.
David Sobel, focusing on the fear of consequences.
And Roger Scruton is another philosopher whose work touches on related themes. George F. Will kind of kicked it off in the mainstream.
Got it. Estock, Sobel, Scruton, Will. Good names to remember.
Each gives you a slightly different angle on this complex feeling.
So let's try and pull this all together then. We've kind of journeyed through ecophobia, haven't we?
Yeah.
Starting from that basic idea, fear of an unlivable planet, and moving to this much richer, maybe more troubling understanding.
Yeah, encompassing that whole spectrum: fear, contempt, indifference, dread, this deep unease about our impact.
And we've seen how it might influence, well, almost everything. Our personal feelings, political actions, even art and theater across time.
And hopefully understanding this concept gives you, the listener, a valuable tool.
A tool. How so?
Well, a way to look at environmental discussions and maybe more importantly, your own reactions to them with a bit more awareness, seeing the emotions and anxieties that might be humming away underneath the surface.
This has definitely been an eye-opener for me. It really reframes things.
Good.
So a final thought for you listening. Maybe take a moment to consider. How do your own feelings about the environment connect with these different facets of ecophobia we talked about?
Does the idea of a spectrum resonate? Or the sense of dread? Or maybe even that subtle indifference?
And how might understanding where your feelings might fit, how might that change the way you engage with environmental news or think about taking action?
Yeah, it's something to mull over. And definitely, if this sparked your interest, dig into those related concepts we mentioned.
Learned helplessness,
Right.
climate crisis, ecocide, eco-criticism.
And check out the work of Estock, Sobel, Scruton. There's a lot more depth there to explore.
Absolutely. Food for thought.